On Friday, October 13, 1307, the King of France arrested the most powerful military order in the medieval world, in a single coordinated dawn strike across an entire kingdom. Within 7 years, every leader of the Knights Templar was burned alive at the stake. They were charged with heresy. They died for a much older crime. They were owed money. And the truth about their innocence sat in a Vatican vault for 700 years. To understand why a king would do this, you have to understand what he was destroying. In the year 1119, a French knight named Hugh de Payens and 8 companions knelt before the king of Jerusalem and swore an oath. They would protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They would live as monks, chastity, poverty, obedience, but they would fight as soldiers. 10 years later, the Church gave them a rule, written under the influence of Bernard of Clairvaux. They became the Knights Templar. For nearly 2 centuries they were the shock troops of Christendom. At Acre, at Jaffa, at every desperate siege, the white mantle and the red cross stood in the breach. But the real revolution was financial. The Templars accepted gold at one commandery in Paris and issued a sealed parchment that could be redeemed for the same gold in Jerusalem. They had invented international banking. Kings deposited their treasuries with them. Popes borrowed from them. By the year 1300, the Paris Temple was the largest bank in Europe. They were warriors. They were monks. They were creditors to crowns. And one of those crowns was France. His name was Philip the Fair, and he was not fair. He was beautiful, cold, and broke. Philip IV had inherited France in 1285 and spent 2 decades waging war, against England, against Flanders, against anyone who could be taxed or conquered. By 1306, the royal treasury was empty, his coinage was being debased, and the people of Paris were rioting in the streets. He had already shown what he was willing to do for money. He expelled the Jews of France in 1306 and seized their property. He turned on the Italian bankers, the Lombards, and seized theirs. But Philip's largest creditor was inside his own kingdom. Inside a fortified compound in the heart of Paris. Inside the temple. He had a man for problems like this. Guillaume de Nogaret. A lawyer. A keeper of seals. A man who had already destroyed a pope. In 1303, on Nogaret's orders, French agents had ridden into Italy and physically assaulted Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni. The old man died weeks later. Nogaret had learned something useful. Sacred power was not as sacred as it looked. Now he turned that lesson toward the Templars. The problem was not how to defeat them in battle, that was impossible. The problem was how to make them disappear in a way the Pope could not stop. The solution would require something that had never been attempted on this scale before. Total surprise. In mid-September 1307, sealed orders left the royal palace in Paris. Royal couriers carried them out across France, to seneschals in Toulouse, to bailiffs in Reims, to officers in Marseille and Carcassonne and Caen. Each man received the same instruction. The seal would be broken on October 12th. Not before. For 3 weeks the kingdom went about its business. The Templars went to Massachusetts. They counted gold. They wrote letters. They did not know. At dawn on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, the seals were broken. Across France, at the same hour, in over 100 places, royal sergeants kicked in doors. Knights were pulled from bed. Treasuries were seized. Around 600 Templars were arrested in France that morning. Eventually, across Europe, the count would reach perhaps 2,000. Not the tens of thousands of legend. Enough. The Grand Master himself was taken in Paris. Jacques de Molay. the 23rd man to hold the office in the order's history. He would also be the last. There had been no warning to the Pope. There had been no trial. There had been no announcement. There had been only the dawn, and the soldiers, and the silence afterwards. And then the questions began. The charges had been written before the arrests. That is how you know what this was. The knights had not yet confessed to anything, and the charges already existed in finished Latin. Heresy. Denial of Christ. Spitting on the cross. Sodomy at initiation. The worship of an idol, a bearded head called Baphomet. The name was almost certainly a French distortion of Muhammad, designed to weaponize a century of Crusader fear into a courtroom. The interrogations began on October 19th. The instruments were medieval and effective. The strappado, wrists tied behind the back, the body hoisted by a rope from the ceiling until the shoulders dislocated. Hot iron beneath the soles of the feet. Sleep withheld for days. Of the 138 Templars interrogated in Paris that autumn, 134 confessed. They confessed to whatever the prepared script demanded. Some signed parchment they could not read. Some died of their wounds. Many, the moment they were given a pope's hearing rather than a king's, retracted. In Avignon, on French soil, the French-born Pope Clement V received the news. Bertrand de Got. A man Philip had effectively installed on the throne of Peter. He was a sick man, and a frightened one. He knew what had happened to Boniface. He knew the threat Nogaret had already made, that France would prosecute the dead Boniface VIII for heresy if Clement did not cooperate. He tried, briefly, to defend the order. Then he stopped trying. For 4 years, the proceedings dragged on. Templars in cells. Confessions taken, retracted, re-extracted. Royal commissions and papal inquiries running on parallel tracks, both increasingly under French direction. In October of 1311, the Pope convened a great church council at Vienne, in the south of France, to settle the matter. Bishops came from across Europe. Many of them, when they actually heard the evidence, were unconvinced. A majority wanted the Templars given a real defense. Philip arrived with an army outside the city walls. The council did not vote. The Pope did not allow it to vote. On the 22nd of March, 1312, Clement V issued the papal bull, Vox in Excelso. By that document, on his sole authority, he dissolved the Order of the Temple. Not because it had been proven guilty, he was careful never to write that. Because, he said, its reputation was now beyond repair. The Order's lands and treasures, officially, went to the Knights Hospitaller. In France, much of it was quietly absorbed by the crown. The debts to the temple, Philip's debts, simply ceased to exist. The accounting was almost complete. There was one piece left. The man who had refused, even under torture, to break. It was meant to be a ceremony of submission. On the 18th of March, 1314, Jacques de Molay, now around 70 years old, was led in chains to a scaffold built on the Parvis of Notre Dame, alongside Geoffroy de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy. Before the assembled clergy, the king's men, and the people of Paris, they were to repeat their tortured confessions one final time, and accept life imprisonment. Molay raised his head. He said the confessions were lies. He said the order was innocent. He said he had only ever broken under torture, and he would not break here. Charny said the same. That had not been on the script. By order of the king, both men were condemned that same day, not as heretics, but as relapsed heretics, a category for which there was only one penalty. That evening they were taken to a small island in the Seine called the Isle aux Juifs and bound to stakes. Witnesses said Molay asked to be tied facing the cathedral, and to have his hands left free so he could pray. The fire was deliberately slow. According to the chronicler Geoffrey of Paris, writing in those very years, Molay called from the smoke for Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to answer for their crimes before God within the year. Whether curse or coincidence, the dates are documented. Pope Clement V died on April 20, 1314, 33 days later. King Philip IV died on November 29, 1314, within the same year. Both, exactly as Molay had said. For 700 years, that was the end of the story. The order destroyed. The confessions on record. The leadership executed. The official church position, ambiguous but never reversed. Then, in 2001, an Italian medieval historian named Barbara Frail was working her way through uncatalogued files in the Vatican Secret Archives. She pulled a parchment out of a folder where it had been misfiled, probably for centuries. She read it. She read it again. It was dated August 1308. It was signed by 3 of Pope Clement V's most senior cardinals. It recorded that those cardinals had traveled in secret to the castle of Chinon, where Jacques de Molay and the other Templar leaders were being held. They had interviewed the men, in private, away from the king's agents. They had heard the retractions of their confessions. And they had, on the Pope's authority, formally absolved them of heresy. In private. In 1308. 6 years before the burning. The Church had known. In 2007, the Vatican released a full facsimile of the document. The implication is unavoidable. Pope Clement V believed, on the testimony of his own cardinals, that the Templars were innocent, and dissolved them anyway because the King of France was the one with the army outside Vienne. The Templars did not die for heresy. They did not die for Baphomet. They died because they were owed money by a king who could not pay. One last clarification, because almost every retelling gets this wrong. The dawn of Friday, October 13, 1307 did not invent the superstition. The link between Friday the 13th and bad luck is a creation of the late 19th and 20th centuries. Medieval Europe did not consider that date cursed. The connection between the Templar arrest and the modern superstition was made retroactively, mostly in pop culture, mostly after 1900. It is a beautiful coincidence. It is not a medieval fact. The medieval fact is enough. When kings owe money, sometimes the cleanest accounting is fire. The Templars were not destroyed for heresy. They were destroyed for being too rich, in front of a man who could not pay. The truth waited 7 centuries in a Vatican drawer for someone to look. If this changed how you see the Middle Ages, subscribe. We reconstruct a lost world every week on Untold Ages.